All right, quick video on replacing the hammer on the PX4. Now to start with, you're going to need to follow your owner's manual to field strip the pistol and remove the back strap to get to this point in disassembly. We've got 3 pins that we need to deal with to take the trigger assembly out. We've got, first one here is the hammer strut pin, or the hammer spring cap pin. This is going to allow you to take pressure off of the system. So to start with, you take a punch, you're going to push on this pin right here. It's helpful to push down, put some pressure on that pin, and also capture that hammer spring cap because it is under spring pressure, so it's going to come out. Once you've removed that, and it doesn't take a lot of pressure, you're going to use the same punch to push out this pin. This is the pin that holds the chassis system in place. You're probably going to need a hammer for this. Just tap it out. It doesn't take a lot of pressure. Once you tap it out, it should pop out fairly easily. And then finally, you're going to need to pop this pin out internally. So you're going to need to cock the hammer, get the trigger bar forward, and take a small flathead screwdriver and insert it down next to the hammer to push that pin out to the left. Once you got it out just a little bit, you can just grab it with your fingernail and it'll slide right out. At this point, go ahead and push down on the decocking lever here. That pushes the sear forward and will drop the hammer down. That's going to allow you to pull the chassis system out of the frame. All right, this is the entire chassis system here. In order to get the hammer out of this system, you have to push down on this spring here to allow that pin to move. It is captured in a groove on the right side of the gun, or the right side of the pin. Now I've got my hammer assembly out. As you can see, this strut is captured in the PX4. There's a small roll pin in there that needs to be knocked out. You need a small, about a 1mm punch. Line it up with that roll pin. Let's get it here. Line up with that roll pin and then just tap that out. There we go. Okay. Now the hammer strut comes away from the actual hammer, and then you have this small roll pin that holds it in place. So now everything is separated. Take the hammer that you want to install in the gun. I'm assuming a Spurless hammer. Install your strut back there. Again, this is the way it needs to look when you reinstall it. It's going to make life a lot easier if you have a pin punch here. Basically, this pin punch holds that roll pin in place. You can do it without it. It's just a lot more difficult. Line it up, make sure it's centered, get it started, and once it's started, you're going to take another punch that's larger than the diameter of that roll pin. That way you won't knock it all the way through. Just tap it a little bit. The goal is to get it about halfway between there. That's all there is to it. It doesn't have to be perfectly centered. You just don't want that roll pin hanging out one side or the other. Now, I'm going to put this hammer system, or the hammer assembly, back into the chassis system. In order to do that, I need that sear out of the way. So make sure your sear is lined up and your spring is back in its original position. And remember that lever we pushed down on before to push the hammer and drop the hammer? We're going to get the sear in front of that and press down and hold that sear in place. Place the hammer in from the rear. You can just set it in the system. Take the hammer pin, slide it through, and then when it gets on the other side, make sure that that spring pops back into that groove again. Now, once you have everything assembled, it'll drop back down into the chassis system. Make sure that the spring goes down into the hole and that the chassis system lines up correctly. When you get about partially inserted here, if you see the groove right there, your trigger bar needs to come around. You have to pull it out and around, drop it down into that groove, and then you're going to have to push it so that it drops down into the frame, and then the entire chassis system just, okay, reassembly, a little bit slower. So here's your sear. See it kind of flopping around. We're going to push that forward, making sure that the spring is lined up. There's a small leg that it hooks onto here and a small leg that hooks onto the side of the sear. And now when I push that forward, this lever right here is the decocking lever. We're going to take that decocking lever and get it behind the sear so that when I push it, it holds that sear in the forward position. All right. With that sear, maintaining pressure on that decocking lever with that sear in place, then I'm going to take the hammer, all right, flat side facing in this direction, place it so that the holes line up. I take my hammer pin, can drop that in that hole. You may have to finagle it a little bit. Then it's capped, now it's in place. Roll over to the other side, and we can see where this hammer pin's trying to come through. I have to push this spring down so that it pops up into that notch. If you look very carefully, you can see where that spring is popping up into that hole, and that is what captures that pin when we reinstall everything. Okay, so now let's slowly reinstall the trigger system or the trigger group back into the frame. So we want to drop it down into the frame so that it goes into the main hammer spring hole, and that all those metal parts slide down right next to that. Once we have the assembly right to this point, if you'll see this cutout right here in the trigger assembly, we need the trigger bar, this part of the trigger bar, which actually catches the hammer hook, to go into that slot. So we're going to have to pull that out and around and drop it down into that slot. Okay, probably going to have to pull the trigger a little bit so that it goes into that slot, and then push on the side of the trigger bar, and then push this chassis system down at the same time. Now everything's reassembled. It drops down in place. Once those pinholes line up, reverse assembly, hammer pin, chassis system pin, and then finally place your strut or your hammer spring cap pin back in place. Assembly's done. Two things before you're finished. First of all, anytime you install a new hammer into a hammer-fired gun, I always like the idea of burnishing the system together. Basically what you're going to do is push up on the hammer as you pull the trigger, and that's going to ensure that you kind of mate those two surfaces. It'll make sure you don't have any steps in your trigger pull. And then go through, make sure you do a proper function check and everything worked correctly. Make sure you guys follow all the safety rules. Make sure the gun's unloaded before you get started. Go out there, guys, have fun. Hope you enjoyed it, and this helps you get that installed for you.